The smell of stale oil and damp concrete shouldn't have been the first thing I smelled when I returned to the place I'd called home for 32 years. It should have been the slow-simmered pot roast Elena usually made on Wednesdays, or at least the lingering scent of her lavender candles. Instead, the air was cold, clinical, and carried the sharp metallic tang of a workspace that had been neglected. I stood in the center of my garage, the heavy door still humming as it settled into its tracks behind me, and I felt my heart do a slow, sickening roll in my chest. I'd spent the last 24 days in a cramped, fluorescent-lit hospital room in Charleston, watching my younger sister, Martha, take her final breaths. My back was a roadmap of knots from that lumpy cot, and my eyes felt like they were filled with hot sand. All I wanted was my own bed, the firm mattress I'd picked out with my late wife, Sarah, the one that looked out over the oak trees in the backyard. I wanted the quiet dignity of my own four walls. But as the overhead shop lights flickered to life, buzzing with an irritating, high-pitched whine, I realized my bed was a world away. Stacked against the far wall, piled high next to my lawnmower and the workbench where I'd taught my grandson to sandwood, were cardboard boxes. Dozens of them. They weren't neatly packed either. They were shoved together with a chaotic, violent energy. I recognized the labels immediately. Arthur, closet. Arthur, nightstand. Arthur, kitchen misc. My life, meticulously built over 6 decades, had been reduced to a series of Sharpie scrawls on recycled cardboard. I didn't know it yet, but the man I had once welcomed into my family with an open heart and a firm handshake had been waiting for this exact moment. He had been counting the days of my absence like a predator watching a wounded animal leave the herd. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly, and pulled the flap of the nearest box. On top sat the framed photograph of Sarah and me on our 25th anniversary. The glass was shattered, a spiderweb of cracks obscuring her smiling face. I felt a surge of heat crawl up my neck. This wasn't a move. This was a desecration. You're back early. The voice was smooth, devoid of any real warmth, and it came from the doorway leading into the kitchen. I turned. Julian Vane stood there, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed over a designer cashmere sweater. A sweater I'd never seen before, likely bought with the emergency funds I'd left for Elena. Julian was a man who carried himself with a manufactured sort of prestige, always looking like he was 5 minutes away from a yacht club meeting, even though he hadn't held a steady job in 18 months. "Julian," I said, my voice sounding like gravel. "Why are my things in the garage?" He didn't move. He didn't offer to take my bag. He just looked at me with a faint, pitying smile that didn't reach his cold, gray eyes. "We had to make some adjustments, Arthur. Logistics, really. With Martha passing, we figured you'd be staying down south longer to handle the estate. We couldn't just let the prime real estate in this house go to waste while we're all cramped in the guest wing." "Prime real estate?" I stepped toward him, my boots clicking sharply on the concrete. "You mean my bedroom? My house?" Julian straightened up, his posture shifting from casual to dominant. "Technically, it's a family residence, and families have to prioritize. My father arrived 3 days ago. His gout is flaring up, and he needs the ensuite bathroom. He can't be expected to walk down the hall in the middle of the night. It's a matter of health, Arthur. Surely you, of all people, understand health crises." The mention of his father, Silas Vane, sent a chill through me. Silas was a man built of vinegar and old money arrogance. He'd lost his fortune in a series of bad real estate plays in the 90s but kept the attitude of a billionaire. I'd met him once at the wedding, and he'd spent the entire rehearsal dinner complaining about the vintage of the wine I'd paid $5,000 for. "Where is Elena?" I demanded, pushing past Julian. He didn't stop me, but he chuckled a low, dry sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. I burst into the kitchen, expecting to see my daughter, expecting her to run to me with an apology, or at least an explanation. But the kitchen wasn't mine anymore. My spice rack was gone, replaced by expensive imported oils. I knew Julian couldn't afford. My old copper pots had been shoved into a corner, replaced by a sleek, black set that looked like it belonged in a museum, not a home. Elena was sitting at the breakfast nook, her head in her hands. She looked up when I entered, and for a split second, I saw the little girl I'd raised alone after Sarah died. I saw the guilt. But then, as Julian stepped into the room behind me and placed a heavy hand on her shoulder, her expression hardened. "Dad," she said, her voice small, "you weren't supposed to be home until Friday. The funeral was moved up, Elena. What is happening?" I gestured wildly toward the garage. "Julian says his father is in my room. My things are in boxes? I've been gone for 3 weeks. It was Silas's idea, but it makes sense, Dad, she said, the words sounding rehearsed, like she'd practiced them under Julian's tutelage. The kids need their space, we need ours, and Silas. He's elderly. He needs the master suite. Julian said you wouldn't mind. You've always been so generous. Generous? Elena, I paid this mortgage off 10 years ago. This is my home. I am 64 years old. I just buried my sister, and you're telling me I've been evicted by a man who doesn't even pay for his own cell phone plan? Julian's hand tightened on Elena's shoulder. Watch your tone, Arthur. You're guest adjacent now. We've set up a very comfortable cot in the workshop area of the garage. It's heated. Mostly. It'll give you the privacy you need during your mourning period. I stared at them, my only daughter, and the man who had systematically dismantled her backbone. I looked at the hallway that led to the master bedroom. I could hear the television blaring from inside. It was a horse racing channel. Silas Vane was in my bed, watching his ponies, while I was being told to sleep next to my circular saw. I felt a phantom weight in my jacket pocket. It was an envelope containing $6,000 in cash. I'd withdrawn it in Charleston, intending to give it to Elena and Julian to help with the rising costs they were always complaining about. I'd wanted to be the provider. I'd wanted to make their lives easier. Julian saw the edge of the envelope. He'd always had a sixth sense for money. "What's that?" he asked, stepping toward me. He didn't wait for an answer. He reached out and plucked it from my pocket with the practiced grace of a pickpocket. He flicked it open, his eyes widening as he saw the hundreds. "Well, I suppose this covers the usage fee for the garage and the extra utilities you'll be consuming. Very responsible of you, Arthur. Give that back," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Julian just tucked the envelope into his own waistband. Now. Let's not be greedy. You're part of a household now. We share. Now, if you'll excuse us, Silas wants his tea, and we were just about to sit down for a family meeting. Since you're not really in the inner circle of house management anymore, it's best if you head out to your quarters. He actually pointed toward the garage. I looked at Elena. I waited for her to scream. I waited for her to slap the smirk off his face. But she just looked back down at her coffee, her silence a louder betrayal than anything Julian could have screamed. "I didn't think it would come to this," I said, looking from the man who stole my money to the daughter who stole my peace. "Life is full of surprises, Arthur," Julian said, walking toward the stove. "Better get used to the cold. The garage door has a bit of a gap at the bottom." I turned and walked back into the garage. I didn't say another word. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of hearing my voice break. I walked to the stack of boxes and found the one containing my old architectural drafting tools. I'd spent 40 years designing skyscraper structures that could withstand hurricanes and earthquakes. I knew everything there was to know about foundations. I knew that if you wanted to take down a massive structure, you didn't start with the roof. You started with the smallest, most vital support beam. I sat down on a plastic crate, the cold of the concrete already seeping through my boots. Through the thin drywall of the kitchen, I heard them laughing. I heard the clink of glasses, my crystal glasses, toasting to their new arrangement. I leaned back against the box of my broken memories and closed my eyes. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully relegated me to the scrap heap of my own life. They saw an old man who was too tired to fight back. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't just an architect. I was a man who had spent his entire career learning how to wait for the perfect moment to execute a plan. I reached into the side pocket of my duffel bag and pulled out my secondary phone, the one I kept for business, the one Julian didn't know existed. I scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I hadn't called in a decade. Silas Vane wasn't the only one with secrets in this town. I glanced at the garage door. The gap Julian mentioned was there, letting in a bitter draft of the evening air. I didn't mind the cold. It helped me think. It helped me sharpen the edge of the rage that was currently hardening into a diamond-sharp resolve. I tapped the call button. "It's Arthur Miller," I said when the voice on the other end answered. "I need a favor, and I need it to be absolute." As I hung up, I heard a loud crash from inside the house, followed by Silas Vane's booming, arrogant laughter. He had dropped something expensive. I didn't know it yet, but that was the last thing he would ever break in my house. Because while they were busy playing kings in my castle, I was about to burn the ground they stood on. I stood up and walked to the garage light switch. I didn't need the light anymore. I could see the path ahead perfectly. What happened next would change everything, and by the time the sun rose, the Vane family would realize that the old man in the garage was the most dangerous person they had ever met. The first night in the garage was a slow descent into a special kind of hell. I've always been a light sleeper, a habit born from years of checking blueprints by moonlight and waking up at dawn, hung AM to beat the concrete trucks to the job site. But this wasn't the productive insomnia of my youth. This was the bone-deep ache of a man who had suddenly realized the floor he'd walked on for 3 decades had been pulled out from under him. I lay on a thin camping mat I'd scavenged from a box labeled Arthur, Outdoor, Misc. It was meant for weekend trips to the Blue Ridge Mountains, not for the cold, unforgiving slab of a 2-car garage in suburban Charlotte. The air was thick with the scent of lawn fertilizer and old motor oil, a sharp contrast to the smell of Sarah's rose garden that used to drift through my bedroom window. I stared up at the exposed rafters, my mind racing through the timeline of how I'd ended up here. I should have seen the cracks in the foundation years ago. When Elena first brought Julian Vane home, I wanted to like him. I really did. He had that polished, Ivy League veneer, the tailored suits, the expensive watch, the way he looked you in the eye and told you exactly what you wanted to hear. He talked about disrupting the market and leveraging assets, buzzwords that made him sound like a visionary to a girl like Elena, who had always been more of a dreamer than a doer. But I'm an architect. I don't look at the paint. I look at the load-bearing walls. And the first time I shook Julian's hand, I noticed his grip was too practiced. It wasn't the handshake of a man who had ever put in a day's work. It was the grip of a man who was used to taking things that didn't belong to him. He's a consultant, Dad, Elena had told me back then, her eyes glowing with a pride I didn't want to extinguish. He helps high-net-worth individuals manage their portfolios. He's going places. I didn't have the heart to tell her that Julian Vane's portfolio seemed to consist mostly of other people's ideas and his father's dwindling reputation. Silas Vane, the patriarch of their fading dynasty, was a man I'd heard of long before Julian darkened my doorstep. The Vans had been local royalty once, owners of textile mills and vast tracts of land, but 3 generations of decadence and bad gambling debts had stripped them down to nothing but a prestigious name and a mountain of resentment. I'd tried to warn her, gently at first. I told her that a man who spends more on his haircut than his rent is usually hiding a void. But Julian was smart. He didn't fight me. He recruited me. He became the helpful son-in-law. When Sarah passed away 5 years ago, I was a ghost. I couldn't handle the paperwork, the taxes, the mundane details of a life that felt empty without her. Julian stepped in. He handled the funeral arrangements, the estate filings, the boring stuff. He made himself indispensable, a parasite that mimics the antibodies of its host. "Let me take the stress off your plate, Arthur," he'd say, pouring me a glass of my own 20-year-old scotch. "You've worked hard your whole life. It's time you just relax." That word, relax, was the first brick in the wall he was building around me. By the time they moved in temporarily, 3 years ago, the trap was already set. They said they were between houses, that a deal had fallen through, and they just needed 6 months to get back on their feet. I welcomed them with open arms. I missed the sound of life in the house. I missed having someone to cook for. I even welcomed the news of my grandchildren Leo and Chloe, thinking that maybe having family around would fill the Sarah-shaped hole in my heart. But as the months turned into years, the temporary arrangement became a permanent occupation. Julian stopped talking about disrupting markets and started talking about family equity. He began suggesting repairs the house didn't need, hiring his own contractors with my money, and slowly, piece by piece, my home started changing. The warm woods were replaced by cold marble. The cozy nooks were knocked down for open-concept spaces that felt as hollow as Julian's promises. The first real warning sign happened 6 months ago. I'd come home early from a site visit and found Julian in my study, going through the safe I kept behind the portrait of Sarah. He didn't even look guilty. "Just checking the insurance riders, Arthur," he'd said. "Not even closing the door. In this economy, you can't be too careful with your assets. We need to make sure the kids are protected." I didn't know it then, but he wasn't looking at insurance. He was looking for the deed. Now, lying on the garage floor, the memory of that moment felt like a physical blow. I could hear the muffled sounds of the house above me, the hum of the central air, the faint vibration of footsteps on the hardwood, my hardwood. The sun began to bleed through the small, high window of the garage around Saw. Hongam. I was already up, sitting on my workbench, staring at the boxes. I felt old, yes, but I also felt a cold, crystalline clarity I hadn't felt since Sarah died. Grief makes you soft, betrayal makes you sharp. I needed to see my grandchildren. Leo was 7, a quiet boy who loved to draw buildings just like I did. Chloe was 5, a firecracker who reminded me so much of Sarah it sometimes hurt to look at her. They were the only reason I hadn't burned the whole situation down the night before. I walked to the interior door and tried the handle. Locked. I knocked, a polite, rhythmic sound. No answer. I knocked harder. Finally, I heard the deadbolt click. The door opened a crack, and Julian stood there, his hair perfectly coiffed even at this hour. He was wearing a silk robe, another item I'd never seen before. "A bit early for a house call, don't you think?" he asked, his voice thick with feigned sleepiness. "I want to see the kids, Julian, and I need a cup of coffee. The children are sleeping. And, as for the coffee, well, we've shifted to a subscription-based bean service. It's quite expensive. We have to be mindful of our overhead now, that there's another mouth to feed in the outbuilding." I felt my jaw tighten so hard I thought a tooth might crack. "I paid for every appliance in that kitchen, Julian. I paid for the electricity running that machine. Move aside." I didn't wait for him to respond. I put my shoulder into the door and pushed. He wasn't expecting the strength. I might be 64, but I spent 4 decades on construction sites. I have old man strength, the kind that's built into the bones, not the kind you get from a gym. Julian stumbled back, a look of genuine shock flickering across his face before the mask of arrogance slid back into place. "Careful, Arthur. Aggression is a symptom of cognitive decline. I'd hate to have to call a specialist." I ignored him and walked straight to the coffee maker. I found a mug, a chipped one with "World's Best Architect" on it that Elena had given me years ago. It had been shoved to the back of the cabinet, behind Julian's gold-rimmed espresso cups. As the coffee brewed, the hallway door opened, and Silas Vane stepped out. He was a tall, gaunt man who moved with a slow, predatory grace. He was wearing my favorite flannel shirt, the one Sarah had bought me for our last anniversary. "Ah, the tenant," Silas said, his voice a raspy drawl. I heard some commotion. "Julian, did you tell him the rules about common areas?" "Rules?" I turned, the hot mug in my hand feeling like a weapon. "Common areas are for primary residents only between the hours of Bai, Hong PM and Chin. Hong AM, Silas said, reaching for the coffee pot I'd just filled. He didn't even look at me as he poured himself a cup. "It's about maintaining the dignity of the home. We can't have outsiders wandering through while we're trying to enjoy our morning." "Outsiders?" I felt a laugh bubble up in my throat, a dry, bitter sound. "Silas, you've been in this house for 72 hours. I've been here for 30 years. You're the outsider." Silas sipped the coffee, winced, and looked at Julian. "The vintage is off. Make sure the next shipment is the Highland roast." Then he turned his cold, sunken eyes back to me. "Possession is 9/10 of the law, Arthur. And right now, I possess the master suite, the kitchen, and the loyalty of your daughter. What do you possess?" "A garage and a box of old blueprints." He was goading me. He wanted me to swing. He wanted a reason to call the police, to get a restraining order, to finalize the exile. I could see Julian in the corner of my eye, his hand already hovering near his phone. "I possess something you Vans lost a long time ago, Silas," I said, my voice dead calm. "I possess the truth." Silas's eyes narrowed. For a split second, the arrogance faltered. It was a tiny crack, a microscopic shift in his posture, but I saw it. "Dad?" Elena stood at the entrance to the kitchen, looking pale and exhausted. She was holding Chloe, who was rubbing her eyes. "Grandpa!" Chloe squealed, squirming out of Elena's arms. She ran toward me, but Julian stepped out, cutting her off. "Not now, Chloe. Grandpa is busy. He's going for a walk. He has a lot of thinking to do. But I want to show him my drawing." "Later," Julian said, his voice firm. He looked at me, a silent command in his eyes. "Leave. Now." I looked at Elena. She wouldn't meet my gaze. She was staring at the floor, her hands twisting the fabric of her robe. She was terrified. Not of me, but of the life she'd built with Julian. She had traded her father for a man who made her feel like she was always one mistake away from losing everything. "I'm going," I said, setting the coffee mug down on the counter. "But Silas, Julian, you should know something about architects. We don't just build things. We study the soil. We look for the rot before we even lay the first brick." I walked toward the garage door, but I stopped at the threshold. I looked back at Silas, who was still wearing my shirt. "That's a nice shirt, Silas. Enjoy it. Because the thing about rot is that once it starts, you can't just paint over it. Eventually, the whole house comes down." I stepped back into the garage and closed the door. I heard the lock click immediately. What they didn't know, what even Elena didn't know, was that while I was in Charleston, I wasn't just sitting by Martha's bedside. Martha had been the keeper of our family's history, and in her final days, she had given me a gift. A set of documents she'd found in our father's old safe deposit box. Documents that concerned the Vane family. Documents that dated back to the Motngin Chintrum Tarmuis, when Silas Vane was at the height of his power, and my father was a junior partner at a law firm that handled the Vane estate. I sat back down on my workbench and pulled out the secondary phone. I had a message from the name I'd called the night before, Elias Thorne. Elias was a man who lived in the shadows of the city's elite. He was a private investigator who specialized in legacy cleaning. He knew where every body was buried in Charlotte, and more importantly, he knew who had provided the shovels. "I found the records, Arthur," the text read. "You were right about the Mutngin Chintrum Tarmui Bai audit. Silas didn't just lose his money, he stole it. And I think I know where he hid the last of the contingency fund. You're not going to believe who's been managing it for him." I felt a cold smile spread across my face. Julian wasn't just a parasite, he was a bagman. He wasn't protecting Elena. He was using my house to launder what was left of the Vane's dirty secrets. I looked at the box of broken glass and Sarah's shattered photo. The anger was gone now, replaced by something much more effective, a strategy. I didn't know it yet, but the usage fee Julian had stolen from me was the most expensive $6,000 he would ever take, because that money was about to fund the demolition of everything the Vane family held dear. What happened next was the first step in a plan that would take me into the heart of Julian's consulting business and reveal a betrayal that went far deeper than a stolen bedroom. The second night in the garage was colder than the first. The Charlotte humidity, usually a heavy blanket, had turned into a damp, biting chill that seeped through the gaps in the door and settled into my marrow. I spent the hours between midnight and dawn staring at a stack of blueprints I'd drawn 20 years ago, the original designs for this very house. I knew every joist, every copper pipe, and every electrical run. I knew the secret crawl space behind the pantry, and exactly which floorboard in the hallway creaked under the weight of a person over 150 pounds. I was a man who understood how things were held together, and I was beginning to see exactly how Julian Vane was tearing it all apart. Bye-bye. Hong a.m. The house began to groan with the sounds of mourning. The heavy thud of Silas Vane's footsteps echoed through the ceiling of the garage, my bedroom, now his throne room. I heard the shower running my shower, and the high-pitched squeal of the kids getting ready for school. I'd usually be the one making them pancakes. I'd be the one making sure Leo had his inhaler, and Chloe had her favorite headband. Now, I was a ghost in the basement. I stepped out of the side door of the garage, into the crisp morning air. I needed to move. If I stayed in that box of shadows, I'd lose my mind. I walked around to the front of the house, my house, and saw Julian's charcoal-colored SUV parked in the center of the driveway, blocking my old sedan. It was a small gesture of dominance, the kind he excelled at. "Morning, Arthur," Julian called out. He was standing on the front porch, coffee in hand, looking like he'd stepped out of a Ralph Lauren catalog. He was wearing a cashmere vest and a pair of leather loafers without socks, the uniform of the effortlessly wealthy, or those desperate to look the part. "Move the car, Julian. I need to get out," I said, not stopping my stride. "And where are we headed? A morning stroll to the park? Maybe a senior center?" He smiled, that practiced, razor-thin expression that always made me want to check my pockets. "Actually, I'm glad you're up. I've been doing some thinking. The garage, it's a bit cluttered, isn't it? Not really a dignified place for a man of your stature. I've taken the liberty of renting a climate-controlled storage unit over on Kensington Road. We can move the rest of your boxes there this afternoon." I stopped. The air felt thin. "You want me to move my belongings out of my own house?" "It's about optimization, Arthur," he said, descending the porch steps. He moved with a predatory grace, closing the distance between us until I could smell the expensive peppermint of his toothpaste. "Silas needs his exercise equipment set up, and the garage is the only place with the floor capacity. It's for his health. Surely you wouldn't want a man with a heart condition to suffer because you're hoarding old magazines and broken tools. My wife's things are in those boxes, Julian. Sarah's journals, her grandmother's china. And they'll be perfectly safe in a secure facility. I'll even pay the first 3 months. Consider it a gesture of goodwill." Goodwill. It was a word that felt like ash in my mouth. I looked past him and saw Elena standing in the doorway. She was wearing a trench coat, her eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses despite the morning overcast. She looked like a woman who was mourning someone who was still standing right in front of her. "Elena!" I called out. Did you hear this? He wants to move Sarah's things to a warehouse. She didn't move. She didn't even look at me. It's just for a little while, Dad, until we get organized. Julian says it'll make the house feel less heavy. Heavy? I whispered. That heaviness is your life, Elena. It's the house you grew up in. Let's go, honey, Julian said, his voice dropping an octave, a low, commanding rumble that made Elena flinch. The kids are waiting in the car. We're going to be late for the Montgomery Academy orientation. Montgomery Academy. The most expensive private school in the state. I hadn't even known they were applying. I certainly wasn't the one paying for it. As they piled into the SUV, Chloe rolled down her window. Grandpa, are you coming with us? I started toward her, a genuine smile breaking through my exhaustion. I'd love to, sweetheart. Julian didn't even let me finish. He hit the power lock and rolled the window up, trapping Chloe's small hand against the glass for a second before it retracted. He backed the SUV out with a violent spray of gravel, nearly clipping my knees. I stood in the driveway, the smell of exhaust filling my lungs, watching the red taillights of my family disappear around the corner of Sterling Lane. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment the old Arthur Miller died. The man who valued peace over pride, who took the hits to keep the family whole, he was gone. In his place was a man who remembered exactly how he'd built his firm from a single desk in a rented basement. I walked back to the garage, but I didn't go inside. I went to the small, unassuming shed at the back of the property. I kept a spare set of keys there, hidden in a false bottom of a birdhouse. I grabbed the keys to my old truck, the one I used for site visits, and drove 10 miles out of the city to a diner called the Rusty Bolt. Elias Thorne was already there, sitting in a corner booth, a mountain of paperwork spread out before him. Elias looked like a man who had seen too much and slept too little. His suit was cheap, his tie was stained with mustard, but his eyes were like two laser beams. "You look like hell, Arthur," Elias said by way of greeting. "I'm sleeping in my garage, Elias." Hell would be an upgrade. He pushed a thick manila folder toward me. I spent the night digging into the Vane family's recent consulting work. You were right. Julian isn't just a bagman for his father. He's much more ambitious than that. I opened the folder. My hands, usually steady as a surgeon's, were shaking. I saw bank statements, shell company registrations, and wire transfer logs. Julian Vane has been using your house as a physical address for 4 different LLCs, Elias explained, his voice low. But here's the kicker. He's been taking out renovation loans against the property, huge ones. He's managed to forge your signature on 3 different equity lines of credit over the last 18 months. I felt the blood drain from my face. He's stealing the house from under me. Worse, he's using the money to fund a high-risk offshore gambling ring that Silas is running out of a server in the Caymans. They're not just broke, Arthur. They're desperate. They're using your pristine credit and your paid-off home as a giant piggy bank to try and win back the Vane fortune. And if the cards don't fall their way, the bank comes for the house. Not Julian. You. I leaned back, the vinyl of the booth squeaking under me. It was a classic long con. They hadn't moved in because they loved me. They had moved in because I was the perfect mark, a grieving widower with a massive asset and a daughter they could manipulate. How long do I have? I asked. Based on the interest rates on these private loans, maybe 60 days before the first default notice hits your mailbox. But there's something else. Elias leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. I looked into Silas Vane's medical records. That heart condition and gout Julian is always talking about, it's a total fabrication. Silas is as healthy as a horse. He's using it to keep you off balance, to make you feel like the healthy one who should be making sacrifices. I thought about Silas wearing my favorite flannel shirt, pretending to be a frail old man while he plotted to leave me homeless. I thought about Julian stealing the SAR, Kongdola I'd intended for my daughter's future. I want them out, Elias. Not just out of the house. I want them buried under the weight of their own lies. I can help with that, Elias said, a grim smile touching his lips. But you have to play the part. You have to be the confused old man for a little while longer. Let them think they've won. Let them get comfortable. A man who thinks he's already won is a man who stops looking over his shoulder. I nodded. I can do that. I've spent my life watching structures settle. I know how to wait. Good, because we need to find the Black Ledger. It's a physical book Silas keeps. My sources say he doesn't trust digital for the high-stakes stuff. It contains the names of the people they're laundering money for. Some very nasty people in the Charlotte underworld. If we get that book, we don't just get your house back. We get the Vans, a permanent residence in a federal penitentiary. I left the diner with a new weight in my pocket, not an envelope of cash, but a digital recorder Elias had given me. When I pulled back into my driveway, Julian was waiting for me. He was standing by the garage door, which was now wide open. My boxes, Sarah's boxes, were being loaded into a white unmarked van by two men who looked more like debt collectors than movers. "What are you doing?" I yelled, jumping out of my truck. "The storage unit was ready early, Arthur," Julian said, checking his watch. "I didn't want to bother you with the heavy lifting. We're clearing out the workshop today. Silas wants his treadmill delivered by 5. I watched as one of the movers carelessly tossed a box labeled Sarah, Wedding, Memories into the back of the van. I heard the unmistakable sound of porcelain shattering. I felt the rage boil up, a white-hot scream wanting to tear out of my throat. I wanted to tackle Julian into the dirt. I wanted to show him exactly what 40 years of manual labor felt like. But then I remembered Elias's voice. A man who thinks he's already won is a man who stops looking over his shoulder. I forced my hands to go limp. I let my shoulders sag. I let a look of hollow, confused defeat wash over my face. I even managed to let a single tear trail down my cheek. "My wife's China," I whispered, sounding like a man who had finally been broken. "Julian, please." That was her grandmother's. Julian looked at the van, then back at me. He didn't offer a word of apology. Instead, he reached out and patted my shoulder, the same shoulder he'd pushed me away from the night before. "Things are just things, Arthur. You have to learn to let go of the past if you want to have a future with this family. Now, why don't you go sit in your truck? This will all be over soon." I turned away, stumbling slightly for effect, and climbed into my truck. I watched them strip my garage bare. I watched them take the last remnants of my life with Sarah and haul them away like trash. But as I sat there, I felt the digital recorder in my pocket. Julian was talking to the movers, his voice loud and arrogant, thinking I was too far gone to hear him. "Make sure that box with the red tape goes to the private office, not the storage unit," Julian barked. "Silas will have my head if anything happens to his account books. And tell the old man we're changing the codes on the garage door tonight. For security." I didn't know it yet, but Julian had just told me exactly where the black ledger was, and he'd just given me the perfect reason to break into my own home. What happened next was the first move in a game Julian didn't even know we were playing. I was no longer just the architect, I was the demolition crew. The beep of the electronic keypad was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. It was a short, sharp, mechanical rejection. 3 times I entered the code the date of Sarah and I's wedding, and 3 times the red light flashed like a mocking eye. Julian had kept his word. The garage door, the only point of entry I had left, was now a dead wall of aluminum. I stood in the driveway, the rain finally beginning to fall in earnest, soaking through my thin jacket. Inside, the house was ablaze with light. I could see shadows moving behind the frosted glass of the dining room, the tall, spindly silhouette of Silas and the broader, more aggressive frame of Julian. They were hosting a dinner. I could see the caterer's van parked down the street, a sleek black vehicle with Kensington Fine Dining embossed in gold on the side. They were using my kitchen, my fine china, and the last of my vintage wine cellar to entertain the very people Julian was trying to swindle. I didn't know it yet, but this dinner wasn't just a social gathering. It was a closing ceremony for the life I'd built. I walked around the side of the house, staying in the shadows of the overgrown private hedge. I felt like a criminal on my own property, a prowler in the garden I'd planted with my own 2 hands. I reached the back patio and looked through the French doors. The scene inside was sickening. Julian was at the head of the table, my seat, holding court with a group of men in sharp suits. I recognized a few of them: Harrison Sterling, a local real estate mogul, and a man named Marcus Montgomery, who sat on the board of the city's largest bank. Julian was leaning back, swirling a glass of mime with Ngin Chin Trum Chinwe Tarm Cabernet, laughing at something Sterling had said. Elena was there, too. She was wearing a black cocktail dress that looked 2 sizes too small, her face caked in makeup that couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes. She wasn't laughing. She looked like a prisoner of war forced to attend a banquet for the invading army. I saw Silas lean over and whisper something in her ear. She flinched, then forced a brittle, terrifying smile. My blood turned to ice. They weren't just using her name for the lounge. They were using her as a prop to sell their image of old money stability. I needed that black ledger. And I knew exactly where Julian had set up his private office. When I designed the house, I'd included a small, sound-insulated room off the back of the library. It was originally intended as a darkroom for Sarah's photography, but later it became my sanctuary, a place to store original hand-drawn blueprints and sensitive contracts. It had its own ventilation shaft and a reinforced door. Most importantly, it had a maintenance hatch accessible through the crawl space in the mudroom. I moved toward the back of the house, where the HVAC unit hummed. I knew the latch was loose. I'd meant to fix it for years. I dropped to my knees, the mud soaking into my trousers, and pried the metal grating back. I was 64, and my joints screamed as I squeezed my frame into the narrow, spider-web darkness beneath the house. I crawled through the dust and the scent of damp earth, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I followed the line of the copper pipes I'd laid myself, moving toward the rear of the library. I reached the hatch and pushed upward. It gave way with a soft creak. I hauled myself into the small, windowless room. The air was cool and smelled of expensive cigars and ozone. The room had been transformed. My drafting table was gone, replaced by a massive mahogany desk. 3 computer monitors glowed in the dim light, displaying scrolling lines of code and what looked like live odds from a sports betting site in Macau. And there, in the corner, sat the box with the red tape. I didn't hesitate. I knelt beside it and tore the tape back. Inside were stacks of ledgers, but one stood out, a leather-bound book with Vain, Legacy, embossed on the cover in fading gold leaf. I opened it. My hands shook as I scanned the pages. It wasn't just gambling debts. It was a roadmap of a decade-long criminal enterprise. Silas Vane hadn't lost his fortune in the 90s. He'd liquidated his legitimate assets to fund a predatory lending scheme. He'd been loan-sharking to the very elites Julian was now trying to impress. But the real shock came on the final page. It was a handwritten note in Julian's sharp, angular script. It was a checklist titled, Exit Strategy, Charlotte. Finalize Mutfur Haimui Dolam Equity Line, A. Miller Signature Verified. Transfer funds to Vane Holdings, Cayman. Declare A. Miller Legally Incompetent Doctor. Halloway scheduled for Mui Lampth. Liquidation of Born Trum Haimui High, Sterling Lane. Pre-sale agreed with Sterling. Relocation, Elena to remain for legal buffer. Liability. I felt the room spin. They weren't just stealing the house. They were planning to sell it to Harrison Sterling, the man currently eating dinner in my dining room, and flee the country with the cash. And they were going to leave Elena behind to take the fall for the forged documents. They were using my daughter as a human shield. He's remarkably resilient, isn't he? The voice came from the other side of the library door. I froze. It was Silas. The old man? Julian's voice followed, sounding oily and satisfied. He's a relic, Silas. He thinks he's playing a game of chess. He doesn't realize we've already taken the board. I heard the clink of a decanter against glass. They were right outside the door. Sterling is ready to sign the pre-contract tonight, Julian continued. He wants the land for that new luxury condo development. He doesn't care about the house. He'll have the whole place leveled by the end of the month. And the daughter? Silas asked. Elena is manageable. She's so terrified of losing the lifestyle I've promised her that she'll say whatever I tell her to. Once the money is in the Cayman account, she's the one whose name is on the secondary loan documents. By the time the bank realizes the signatures are forged, we'll be in Zurich. She'll be the one dealing with the fraud investigators. It's poetic, really. The architect's daughter, buried under the ruins of his favorite building. They laughed. A cold, echoed sound that stripped away every ounce of mercy I had left in my soul. I gripped the black ledger so hard my knuckles turned white. I wanted to burst through that door. I wanted to wrap my hands around Julian's throat and show him exactly how much residue a 64-year-old man had left, but I couldn't. Not yet. I had the book, but I needed the signature. I needed Julian to actually sign that pre-contract with Sterling. If I stopped them now, they'd walk away with the money they'd already stolen. I needed them caught in the act of selling what wasn't theirs. I tucked the ledger into the waistband of my trousers and lowered myself back into the crawl space. I made it out of the house, just as the rain turned into a torrential downpour. I ran to my truck, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't go back to the garage. I didn't go back to the sanctuary Julian had left me. I drove straight to Elias Thorne's office. You have it? Elias asked, looking up from a grainy surveillance monitor as I burst through his door, covered in mud and rage. I threw the black ledger onto his desk. It's all in there. The laundering, the names, the offshore accounts. But Elias, they're selling the house tonight. To Sterling. They're planning to leave Elena behind to go to prison for them. Elias opened the book, his eyes scanning the entries. He let out a long, low whistle. This is bigger than I thought, Arthur. They're not just laundering money. They're hiding assets for the Blackwood family. The Blackwoods. The mere mention of the name made the air in the room feel heavy. They were the unofficial shadows of the city, a family whose wealth was built on things that never saw the light of day. If Julian was stealing from them to fund his escape, he wasn't just a thief, he was a dead man walking. "What do we do?" I asked. "We let them sign," Elias said, reaching for his coat. "But we don't call the police." "Not yet." "Then who do we call?" Elias looked at me, a grim, terrifying light in his eyes. "We call the owners of the money Julian has been misplacing. We tell the Blackwoods that their bagman is about to skip town with their retirement fund." I felt a shiver of pure, cold terror. This wasn't a legal battle anymore. This was a war. "I want my daughter safe, Elias," I said. "No matter what happens, Elena stays clear of this. That's the hard part, Arthur. To save her, she's going to have to see exactly who she married. She's going to have to be the one to hand him over." I looked out the window at the rain-slicked streets of Charlotte. I thought about the little girl who used to sit on my lap and help me draw the perfect house. I thought about the woman who sat silent while her husband insulted her father. What happened next would either save my family or destroy us all. But as I watched Elias pick up the phone, I knew there was no turning back. The architect was done drawing. It was time to start the demolition. I drove back to the house, but I didn't park in the driveway. I parked 3 blocks away and walked back through the woods. I needed to be there when Sterling signed. I needed to see Julian's face when the foundation he'd stolen began to crumble. I reached the edge of the lawn and saw a black sedan pull up. It wasn't a caterer. It wasn't a guest. 2 men stepped out. They were dressed in charcoal suits, their faces expressionless, their movements synchronized. They didn't knock. They walked straight to the front door and entered like they owned the place. I realized then that Elias had already made the call. I didn't know it yet, but the dinner party at Borntrum Heimwee High Sterling Lane was about to have 2 very uninvited guests, and Julian Vane was about to learn that there are some people you can't consult your way out of. I moved closer to the window, the digital recorder in my hand. "The time for revenge has come," I whispered to the rain. "The time to show them who really has the power." I stood in the shadows of the weeping willow at the edge of the patio, the rain turning the manicured lawn into a marsh. My lungs burned with every breath, and the heavy leather of the black ledger pressed against my spine, a cold reminder of the rot I'd pulled from the foundations of my own home. Through the high, arched windows of the dining room, the scene looked like a painting of the American dream until you looked at the eyes of the people inside. Harrison Sterling sat with a fountain pen poised over a thick stack of legal documents. He was a man who smelled of cedarwood and predatory interest rates, the kind of man who didn't buy homes. He bought zip codes. Julian was leaning over him, his face illuminated by the chandelier, looking like the cat that had finally swallowed the canary, the cage, and the entire house. "It's a clean title, Harrison." I heard Julian's voice drift through a cracked pane, oily and confident. "My father-in-law is, well, he's in a state of terminal confusion. My wife, Elena, has full power of attorney. We're ready to move this asset and get out of your way." I watched Elena. She was standing by the sideboard, her knuckles white as she gripped a crystal decanter. She looked at the papers on the table, then at her husband. She knew something was wrong. She could feel the vibration of the lie, even if she hadn't seen the blueprints of the betrayal yet. The front door chimes didn't ring. Instead, the heavy oak door simply swung open, and the 2 men I'd seen earlier, Jax and Vance, stepped into the foyer. They didn't take off their coats. They didn't shake the rain from their umbrellas. They walked into the dining room with the terrifying stillness of men who didn't need to raise their voices to be heard. Julian's smile didn't just fade. It curdled. He straightened up, his eyes darting toward the hallway, looking for an exit that didn't exist. "Jax," Julian stammered, his voice jumping an octave. "I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow. We're in the middle of a private closing." Jax, the taller of the 2, with a scar that bisected his left eyebrow and a suit that cost more than my truck, didn't look at the house. He didn't look at Sterling. He looked directly at Julian. "The Blackwoods don't like waiting, Julian," Jax said. His voice was a low, melodic growl that seemed to vibrate the glass on the table. "And they especially don't like hearing that their consultant is selling off his collateral before he's settled his debts with the family." Harrison Sterling froze. He looked at the men, then at Julian, and slowly pulled his hand away from the pen. He hadn't reached the top of the Charlotte real estate world by being a fool. He knew exactly what kind of men had just walked into the room. "Julian?" Sterling asked, his voice cold. "Who are these gentlemen, and what debts are they referring to?" "It's nothing, Harrison," Julian lied, though even he didn't seem to believe it. He turned to Jax, his hands shaking as he reached for a glass of wine. I told you the liquidity is coming. Once Sterling signs for the land, the Blackwood accounts will be the first to be topped off. I just need 48 hours. Vance, the younger one, laughed. It was a sharp, ugly sound. He walked over to the table and picked up the contract. He flipped through the pages with a bored expression before tossing it back onto the mahogany. 48 hours is a long time to stay alive when you owe $5 million to people who don't believe in bankruptcy court. Elena let out a small, strangled gasp. She stepped forward, her eyes wide. 5 million? Julian, what are they talking about? We're selling the house to start over in Charleston. You said the loans were for the business. Julian didn't look at her. He didn't even acknowledge she was in the room. He was staring at Jax, pleading with his eyes. I didn't know it yet, but the man I had entrusted with my daughter's heart was currently calculating how many pieces he could break her into to save his own skin. The business is fine, Elena, Julian snapped, finally turning to her. The mask had slipped completely now. The consultant was gone, replaced by a cornered rat. But your father, the old man, he's the one who authorized the secondary lines of credit. He's the one who's been skimming from the Blackwood Fund to hide his own gambling debts. I've been trying to cover for him, to keep him out of jail, but he's senile. He's ruined us. I felt a roar of blood in my ears. He was doing it. He was pinning the entire $5 million theft on a man who had spent his life building schools and libraries. He was using my confusion as the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. Inside, I saw Silas Vane emerge from the shadows of the hallway. He looked at the enforcers, then at his son. He didn't look surprised. He looked disappointed, like a teacher watching a student fail a test he'd already given him the answers to. The boy is right, Jax, Silas said, his voice raspy and authoritative. Arthur Miller has been a liability for years. We took over the house to audit the damage he's done. We're liquidating the property tonight to pay back the Blackwoods. My son is just the messenger. Elena looked from Julian to Silas, her face twisting in a mask of pure, agonizing realization. She looked at the documents on the table, the ones Julian had told her were standard paperwork for their move. She reached out and grabbed the top sheet, the one with my signature on it. This isn't Dad's signature, she whispered. She looked closer, her eyes scanning the page. He always loops the A under the track. Julian, this is your handwriting. The room went deathly silent. Julian took a step toward her, his face dark with a sudden, violent rage. Give me that paper, Elena. No, she said, her voice growing stronger. You forged his name. You're selling his house without him even knowing. You're the one stealing from these people. Julian didn't hesitate. He swung his hand, the back of it catching Elena across the cheek. The sound of the impact was like a gunshot in the quiet room. She stumbled back, the crystal decanter falling from the sideboard and shattering into 1,000 glittering shards on the floor. I said, "Give me the paper," Julian screamed. I didn't wait for Jax to react. I didn't wait for Sterling to call the police. I didn't care about the ledger in that moment. I stepped out of the shadows and threw my shoulder against the French doors. The glass shattered as I burst into the room, my jacket soaked, my eyes fixed on the man who had just struck my daughter. Julian spun around, his face pale as he saw me. Arthur, how the hell did you get in here? I didn't answer him. I walked straight to Elena and pulled her behind me. Her lip was bleeding, and her eyes were filled with a shame that broke my heart into a million pieces. It's over, Julian, I said, my voice vibrating with a decade's worth of repressed fury. It's not over, you old fool. Julian lunged for the mahogany desk, his hand reaching for the drawer where he kept his private items. I have the power of attorney. I have the bank records. I have everything. He ripped the drawer open, reaching for the black ledger, the one thing he thought would prove his audit of my accounts. He searched the drawer, his movements growing more frantic by the second. He tossed papers onto the floor, his breath coming in ragged, desperate hitches. Where is it? He shrieked, looking at Silas. Silas, where is the book? It was right here. I reached into my waistband and pulled out the leather-bound ledger. I held it up, the gold-embossed Vane legacy, catching the light of the chandelier. Looking for this? I asked. The color didn't just leave Julian's face. It seemed to leave his entire body. He slumped against the desk, his eyes fixed on the book that contained the death warrant for his family's reputation. Jack stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the ledger in my hand. Is that the accounting for the Blackwood funds, Mr. Miller? It is, I said, opening the book to the final page, the one with Julian's exit strategy, written in his own hand. And it shows exactly who was planning to skip town with your $5 million. It wasn't the senile architect. It was the consultant who thought he could use my daughter as a human shield. Jax took the book from my hand. He read the page in silence, his face becoming a mask of cold, professional murder. He looked up at Julian, who was now shaking so hard he could barely stand. "Vance," Jax said, not taking his eyes off Julian. "Call the Mr. Blackwood. Tell him we found the leak, and tell him we're going to need the heavy-duty plastic for the van." Julian let out a pathetic, whimpering sound. He fell to his knees, his hands clasped in prayer. "No, please! It was Silas! He made me do it! He's the one who wanted the money!" Silas Vane didn't even look at his son. He turned to Jax, his expression as calm as a frozen lake. "The boy was always weak, Jax. Do what you have to do. Just remember who kept the accounts for 20 years before he messed them up." "Don't worry, Silas," Jax said. "There's enough room in the van for both of you." Harrison Sterling stood up, his face white. "I'm leaving. I want nothing to do with this. The deal is dead, Julian. You're dead." He stormed out of the house, leaving the front door hanging open to the rain. I looked at my daughter. She was staring at Julian, the man she had loved, the man she had defended against her own father. She saw him now not as a visionary, not as a provider, but as a small, pathetic thief who would have sent her to prison to save his own skin. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm so sorry." "I know, honey," I said, pulling her close. "I know." But the escalation wasn't finished. Because as Jax reached for his phone, Julian's eyes snapped to the fireplace where a heavy iron poker rested on the hearth. He wasn't going to go quietly, and he wasn't going to go alone. What happened next changed the trajectory of my life forever. Because in that room, under the flickering lights of a house that was no longer a home, the old man had to decide exactly how far he was willing to go to protect what was left of his blood. Julian lunged for the poker, his face twisted in a mask of pure, psychotic desperation. "If I'm going down," he screamed, "I'm taking the whole damn foundation with me." He didn't swing at Jax. He didn't swing at me. He turned and swung the heavy iron rod straight at the one thing that still mattered to me. The iron sang as it sliced through the stagnant air of the dining room. Julian wasn't aiming for Jax or Vance. He knew he couldn't take them. He was aiming for Elena. In his twisted, collapsing mind, she was the reason the old money dream had curdled. She was the witness who had looked at the forged signature and seen the monster beneath the cashmere. I didn't think. I didn't have time to calculate load-bearing angles or stress points. I simply threw myself into the path of the blow. The heavy iron poker caught me square across the forearm and ribs. I heard a sickening crack, the sound of a dry branch snapping in a winter storm, and the world dissolved into a blinding white flash of agony. I hit the floor hard, the breath driven out of my lungs, my vision swimming in a sea of gray static. "Dad." Elena's scream sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. I tried to gasp, but my lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. I rolled onto my side, clutching my arm, which was already beginning to throb with a rhythmic, pulsing heat. Through the haze, I saw Jax move. He didn't run. He glided. He caught Julian's wrist mid-swing for a second strike, twisting it with a casual, brutal efficiency. Another snap. This one was Julian's wrist. The poker clattered to the floor, and Julian let out a high-pitched, melodic wail that ended in a choked sob as Vance drove a knee into his stomach. "Enough," Jax said, his voice as cold and flat as a tombstone. He looked down at me, his eyes devoid of pity but filled with a strange professional respect. "You've got grit, Miller. Most men your age would have stayed in the garage." He turned his gaze to Silas, who was still standing by the sideboard, calmly sipping a glass of water as if he were watching a moderately interesting play. "Pack them up," Jax commanded Vance. "Mr. Blackwood wants to see the consultants before the sun comes up. And take the ledger. Every page of it." Vance grabbed Julian by the collar, dragging him toward the door. Julian was babbling now, a stream of incoherent pleas and apologies, his designer loafers scuffing uselessly against the hardwood. Silas followed, his head held high, his dignity a thin, pathetic veil over the emptiness of his soul. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at his daughter-in-law. He just walked out into the rain, a ghost of a dynasty that had finally run out of time. Then, the house went silent. The front door stood open, letting in the mist and the smell of wet pavement. Elena was on her knees beside me, her hands hovering over my shattered arm, afraid to touch me. Her face was a mask of shock, the blood from her lips staining her teeth. "Don't move, Dad. I'm calling Chin Trum Mui Mot," she sobbed, her fingers fumbling with her phone. "No," I wheezed, finally catching a ragged breath. "No police. Not yet." If the police come now, the Blackwoods, they'll burn this place down to erase the evidence. We can't have them as enemies, Elena. Not while the Vans still owe them $5 million. I managed to sit up, my head spinning. The pain was a living thing now, a snarling beast in my shoulder. I looked around at my dining room. It was a wreck. Broken crystal, overturned chairs, the smell of expensive wine and cheap violence. I didn't know it yet, but this was my rock bottom. I was an old man with a broken body, a traumatized daughter, and a house that was technically owned by a bank thanks to a series of forged loans I couldn't yet prove were fraudulent. I had no money, no master suite, and the people who actually ran this city were currently deciding whether I was a witness or an accomplice. But as I looked at the shattered remains of my life, I felt a strange, terrifying sense of freedom. When you have nothing left to lose, you stop being afraid of the fall. "Help me up," I told Elena. She helped me onto the sofa in the living room. I told her to go to the freezer and get a bag of peas for my arm. While she was gone, I pulled my secondary phone from my pocket. My hand was shaking so hard I almost dropped it. I called Elias Thorne. "It's done," I whispered when he picked up. "The Blackwoods took them, but Sterling walked. He knows the title is tainted now. Elias. He's going to sue me to get his deposit back, or he's going to try to force the sale through the courts. I'm trapped." "Not yet. You aren't," Elias said, the sound of keyboard clicking in the background. "I spent the last hour cross-referencing the names in that ledger you photographed. There's something Julian didn't realize. Silas wasn't just laundering money for the Blackwoods. He was keeping a Plan B file. It's digital, hidden on a cloud server masked as a Montgomery Academy parent portal." I frowned, the pain making it hard to focus. "What's in it?" "The real reason Silas lost his fortune in the 90s. It wasn't bad real estate, Arthur. He was framed by the Sterling family. Harrison Sterling's father was the one who liquidated the vein mills. Silas has been planning a great reversal for 30 years. He wasn't just selling your house to Sterling. He was setting Sterling up for a massive fraud charge that would have collapsed the entire Sterling real estate group." I felt a cold chill wash over me. Silas Vane wasn't just a parasite. He was a vengeful ghost. He had been using me to get to the man who had ruined him. "If you can get into that server, Arthur, you don't just have leverage over the Blackwoods. You have the power to destroy Harrison Sterling. You can make him pay off your debt just to keep his name out of the papers." "How do I get the password?" I asked. "The ledger," Elias said. "Look at the dates. Silas is a man of habit. He'd use something sentimental, something he thinks belongs only to him." I closed my eyes, thinking back to the brief moments I'd spent around Silas. He was a man obsessed with his legacy. I remembered him staring at the portrait of Sarah, his lip curling in contempt. I remembered him talking about the vintage of the wine. Then, it hit me. Silas had a signet ring. He'd pointed it out at the wedding, a heavy gold band with the Vane family crest and a date, Mutngin Tarm Chum Chin Wei Hai, the year the first vein mill opened. "Try. Legacy Mutngin Tam Chum Chin Wei Hai," I said. "1 second. I heard the frantic tapping of keys. Bingo. "Arthur, you aren't going to believe this. The renovation loans Julian took out, they weren't just for gambling. They were used to buy up distressed debt tied to Sterling's new condo project. You, technically, through the forged LLCs, now own the primary debt on Harrison Sterling's biggest development." I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. The reversal was beginning. Julian and Silas had built a cage for me, but in their arrogance, they had handed me the keys to a kingdom they didn't even know they'd conquered. Elena came back into the room, her eyes red and puffy. She sat on the edge of the coffee table, holding the ice pack to my arm. "Dad, what are we going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The Vanes are gone, but the bank, the house. We're going to lose everything, aren't we?" I looked at her, and for the first time in months, I didn't see the woman who had betrayed me. I saw the girl who used to help me with my blueprints. "No, Elena," I said, my voice gaining a hardness she'd never heard before. "We aren't losing anything. We're going to rebuild. But first we have to finish the demolition." I stayed on that sofa for 3 hours, moving only to swallow 2 of my old prescription painkillers. My arm was broken, my ribs were purple, but my mind was a laser. I dictated a series of emails to Elias. I told him exactly which documents to leak to the Charlotte Ledger and which ones to send directly to Harrison Sterling's private inbox. "Bye-bye. Kong AM," the first response came in. It was a text from an unknown number. "Mr. Miller, we need to talk. My office. Bye. Kong AM. Bring the digital files and I'll bring the deed release. H." Sterling. I didn't know it yet, but the man who had walked out of my house in a huff was now the most desperate man in the city. The sun began to rise over Sterling Lane, casting long, pale shadows across the wet pavement. I stood up, leaning on Elena for support. My body screamed in protest, but I forced myself to walk to the master bedroom. I pushed the door open. The bed was unmade, the scent of Silas's sour cologne still hanging in the air. I walked to the window and pulled back the heavy curtains. The oak trees were still there. The world hadn't ended. I saw a black sedan idling at the end of the driveway. It wasn't the Blackwoods. It was a man I recognized from the bank. He was holding a stack of foreclosure notices. I walked out to the front porch, the morning air stinging my face. The man looked at me, then at the house, then back at his papers. "Arthur Miller?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "I'm here regarding the default on the equity line." I didn't flinch. I didn't beg. I looked him in the eye and handed him a single sheet of paper Elias had faxed to the local branch 10 minutes ago. It was a temporary restraining order on all collection activities, signed by a judge who happened to be one of the names in Silas's ledger. "I think you'll find the account has been credited," I said. "Check your system again." The man looked at his tablet, his eyes widening as he saw the balance. The six-figure debt had been wiped clean, replaced by a wire transfer from a Sterling real estate holding company. "My apologies, Mr. Miller," the man said, sounding genuinely confused. "There must have been a technical error." "There was a human error," I corrected. "It's been fixed." He got into his car and drove away. I turned to Elena, who was standing in the doorway, her mouth agape. "How?" she whispered. "I didn't know it yet, but the old man they tried to bury was actually the only one who knew where the treasure was hidden." "We have the house back, Elena," I said. "But we aren't staying here." "What? Why?" "Because a house is just wood and stone. And right now, this wood and stone is soaked in the blood of people I never want to think about again. We're going to sell it, all of it. And we're going to start something new, somewhere they can't find us." But as I turned to go back inside to pack the few things I had left, a car pulled into the driveway. It was a sleek, silver Mercedes. The door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was in her late 50s, dressed in a sharp power suit, her hair a silver bob that looked like it was spun from moonlight. She looked at the house, then at me, and a slow, triumphant smile spread across her face. It was Sarah's sister, Clara, the one woman Sarah had told me never to trust, and the one woman who held the final piece of the Vane family puzzle. "Hello, Arthur," Clara said, her voice like silk over glass. "I heard you had a little termite problem. I thought I'd come by to see if there was anything left worth saving." I felt a new kind of tension coil in my stomach. The Vanes were gone, but the real architect of my misery had just arrived. What happened next was a twist I never saw coming, and it would require me to make a deal with a devil I'd spent 30 years avoiding. "Clara," I said, my voice steady. "I assume you're here for the legacy file." "I'm here for my share, Arthur," she said, walking toward the porch. "After all, I'm the one who introduced Julian to Elena in the first place." The betrayal went all the way back to the beginning. The morning air was thick with the scent of ozone and wet pine, but Clara's perfume, something expensive and suffocatingly floral, cut through it like a blade. She stood on my porch, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, looking at my broken arm and blood-stained shirt, with the detached curiosity of a bird, watching a worm struggle on a hook. "You always were a bit of a martyr, Arthur," Clara said, stepping past me into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. She ran a gloved finger over the hall table, checking for dust even as she navigated the wreckage of the night before. "Sarah loved that about you. She thought your integrity was a load-bearing wall. I always knew it was just a facade." I leaned against the doorframe, my ribs screaming with every shallow breath. Elena stood behind me, her face pale, her eyes darting between me and her aunt. This was the woman who had brought Julian into our lives, the woman Elena had turned to for advice when her marriage started to fray. "You introduced them," Elena whispered, her voice cracking. "You told me he was from a good family. You told me he would take care of us." Clara turned, a chillingly sweet smile on her lips. "He was from a good family, dear. A family that owed me a very large sum of money. Julian was a charming distraction, a way to keep you occupied while I worked with Silas to reorganize the family assets. I didn't think Julian would be quite so clumsy with the ironwork, but then again, he was always a bit impulsive. I didn't know it yet, but the real snake wasn't the one rattling in the grass. It was the one that had been invited to every Thanksgiving dinner for 30 years. "What do you want, Clara?" I asked, my voice a low, dangerous rumble. The digital key to the Vane legacy file, she said, her eyes losing their warmth. I know you have it. Elias Thorne doesn't move a muscle without a client's lead, and you're the only one left standing with a motive. That file contains records of my private investments with the Vane's investments that the IRS and the Blackwood family don't need to see. Give me the drive, and I'll make sure Harrison Sterling pays you double for this plot of land. You can take Elena and the kids, move to the coast, and pretend this was all a bad dream. I looked at her, the sister of the woman I'd loved with all my soul. She was willing to sell out her own niece and brother-in-law for a sanitized ledger and a few $1 million in hush money. And if I don't? Clara leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. Then I'll tell the police that you were the one laundering the money. I have 3 years of emails, Arthur. Emails from your account sent by Julian, of course. But who's going to believe a grieving, senile old man over a pillar of the community? You'll spend your final years in a state facility, and Elena will be looking at a fraud charge that will keep her away from her children for a decade. She was good. She had spent decades designing this trap, long before the Vanes even entered the picture. She had played the long game, waiting for Sarah to pass, waiting for me to weaken. I need an hour, I said. The drive is in a safe deposit box downtown. You have 45 minutes, Clara said, checking her gold watch. I'll be in the garden. It's the only part of this house that doesn't smell like failure. She walked out the back door as if she owned the sky above us. I turned to Elena. She looked like she was about to collapse. Dad, what are we going to do? She's right. No one will believe us. I reached out with my good hand and gripped her shoulder. Architecture isn't just about building things up, Elena. It's about knowing exactly where to place the explosive charges to make a building fall into its own footprint. Clara thinks she's the architect here. She's forgotten that I'm the one who drew the original plans. I walked to the kitchen and grabbed my secondary phone. I didn't call Elias. I called Jax. Miller, the voice answered on the second ring. You're still alive. That's a surprise. I have something you want, I said. Something better than the ledger. I have the woman who is actually running the Vane's offshore accounts. The one who's been skimming from your family for 10 years. Clara Kensington, Jax said, and I could hear the cold interest in his voice. We've suspected her, but she's been very careful with her tracks. She's in my garden right now, and she's about to hand me a signed confession because she thinks I'm too broken to fight back. Be at the Sterling Real Estate Group headquarters in 30 minutes. I'm going to give you a show. I didn't wait for his answer. I grabbed my keys and looked at Elena. Get the kids. Take them to the hotel we stayed at last night. Actually send the room. Don't open the door for anyone but me or Elias. What about you? I'm going to go see an old friend about a building. The Sterling Group headquarters was a monolith of glass and steel in the heart of the city, a building I had actually consulted on 15 years ago. I knew the service elevators, the security rotations, and the private entrance to the executive suite. I walked into the lobby, my arm in a makeshift sling, looking like a man who had been through a war. The receptionist tried to stop me, but I didn't slow down. I walked straight to the executive elevator and swiped a keycard Elias had acquired for me months ago. When I stepped into Harrison Sterling's office, he was sitting behind a desk that cost more than my first house. He looked up, his face a mask of irritation and fear. Miller, what the hell is this? I told you by Hung AM. It's nearly noon. Plans changed, Harrison, I said, sitting in the chair across from him. I felt a rib grate against another, and I winced, but I didn't let my voice shake. Clara Kensington is trying to blackmail me. She wants me to hand over the Vane files, so she can bury her involvement in the fraud against your company. Sterling stiffened. Clara, she's a partner in 3 of my developments. She was a partner, Harrison. She's also the one who provided Julian with the templates for your signatures. She wasn't just helping them steal from me, she was helping them hollow out your company from the inside. She's been using the Vanes to siphon your project funds into her own accounts for years. I threw a tablet onto his desk. On the screen was a series of wire transfers Elias had uncovered only an hour ago, money moving from Sterling Real Estate to a shell company owned by Clara, masked as consulting fees for Julian. Sterling's face went from pale to a deep, dangerous purple. That's $40 million. At least, I said. And she's at my house right now, waiting for me to give her the proof so she can delete it. But I have a better idea. I'm listening, Sterling hissed. You're going to buy my house. Not for the land value, but for the peace of mind value. You're going to pay $10 million. 5 covers the loans Julian took out, and the other 5 goes into a trust for my grandchildren. In exchange, I give you the files that incriminate Clara. You get to be the hero who discovered the internal fraud. You get to sue her for everything she's worth, and I get to disappear. And the Blackwoods? Sterling asked. They won't just let $40 million walk away. That's the beauty of it, Harrison, I said, leaning forward. The Blackwoods already have Julian and Silas. They're looking for the person who actually stole their money. If you hand them Clara on a silver platter, along with the proof of her skimming, they'll leave you alone. They'll have their scapegoat, and you'll have your company back. Sterling looked at the tablet, then at me. He was a shark, and he could smell the blood in the water. He knew I was giving him a lifeline, even if it was wrapped in barbed wire. You're a cold man, Arthur Miller, he said, reaching for his pen. I'm an architect, Harrison. I just know how to read the stresses. He signed the deed release and the trust agreement right there. I watched him initial the final page, feeling the weight of the last 3 years finally begin to lift. The house was no longer a noose around my neck. It was a weapon I had successfully fired. But the real work was yet to come. I left Sterling's office and drove back to Borntrum High Sterling Lane. Clara was still in the garden, sipping tea she'd made in my kitchen. She looked up as I approached, her eyes narrowing. You're late, Arthur. Do you have the drive? I have something better, Clara, I said, holding up my phone. I have a live feed of Harrison Sterling's office. He's currently handing over your bank records to a pair of gentlemen named Jax and Vance. It turns out, they don't take kindly to people skimming from their family's investments. Clara stood up so fast her chair overturned. Her face transformed into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. You wouldn't. You'd destroy yourself just to hit me? I'm already broken, Clara, I said, gesturing to my arm. But you're built on a foundation of cards, and I just pulled the bottom one. I heard the sound of tires on the gravel driveway. 2 black sedans pulled up, blocking her exit. Clara looked at the cars, then at me, her mouth working but no sound coming out. The real twist, Clara, I said, stepping back as Jax and Vance stepped out of the cars, is that I didn't just find your name in the ledger. I found Sarah's journals in that storage unit Julian rented. She knew what you were doing. She'd been documenting your loans from our father's estate for years. She was going to confront you, but she got sick. She left the journals for me, but I was too blinded by grief to read them. I felt a tear sting my eye, but I brushed it away. You didn't just betray me, Clara. You betrayed your sister. And in this house, that's the one sin that doesn't get a second chance. Jax walked into the garden, his eyes fixed on Clara. He didn't say a word. He just held open the door of the lead sedan. Clara looked at me one last time, her poise finally shattering. She began to scream, a high-pitched, jagged sound that echoed through the trees I'd planted with Sarah. She begged. She pleaded. She offered me money, land, 1,000 apologies. I didn't say a word. I just watched as they put her in the car and drove away. The garden went quiet. The rain started again, a soft, cleansing mist that washed the scent of her perfume from the air. I stood there, alone in the wreckage, for a long time. Dad? Elena was standing on the porch. She had come back. She saw the empty driveway, the overturned chair, and the look on my face. Is it over? She asked. The demolition is finished, Elena, I said, walking toward her. The ground is clear. What do we do now? I looked at the house, the place where I'd laughed, where I'd cried, where I'd been betrayed, and where I'd finally fought back. It was a beautiful structure, but it was haunted. We leave, I said. We go to that hotel, we pick up the kids, and we drive until we find a place where the air doesn't taste like old secrets. I walked into the house and grabbed the one thing I couldn't leave behind, the framed photo of Sarah. The glass was still broken, but the picture inside was perfect. She was smiling, her eyes full of the kind of light that Julian, Silas, and Clara could never understand. I walked out the front door and locked it for the last time. I didn't know it yet, but the final twist of this story wasn't about the money or the revenge. It was about what happens when you finally stop trying to save a building that was never meant to stand. As I pulled out of the driveway, I saw a sold sign already being hammered into the lawn by one of Sterling's men. I didn't look back. I had a new blueprint to draw. And this time, I was going to make sure the foundation was built on nothing but the truth. The engine of my old truck hummed with a steady, rhythmic vibration that felt like the only thing keeping my world from spinning off its axis. We were 3 hours east of Charlotte, the skyline of glass and betrayal fading into a blur of gray in my rearview mirror. Beside me, Elena slept with her head against the window, her breath fogging the glass. In the back seat, Leo and Chloe were curled under a shared blanket, the dinosaur backpack tucked between them. The silence was heavy, But it wasn't the suffocating silence of the garage. It was the quiet of a structure that had finally settled after a massive shift in the earth. My arm, encased in a fresh cast and resting in a professional sling, throbbed with a dull, manageable ache. The painkillers were doing their job, but the clarity I felt was sharper than any drug could provide. I pulled into a rest stop overlooking the marshes of the low country. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long, golden fingers across the tall grass. I didn't wake them. I just sat there, my good hand resting on the steering wheel, looking at the envelope on the dashboard. It contained the final trust documents from Sterling and a small leather-bound notebook I'd pulled from Sarah's hidden box in the storage unit. I'd spent my life thinking I was the protector, the architect who kept the storms at bay. I thought I was the one who saw the rot. But as I opened that notebook under the fading light of the South Carolina sky, I realized I'd been the apprentice all along. Arthur sees the buildings. Sarah's handwriting began on a page dated 2 years before her diagnosis. He sees the steel and the stone. He thinks that if he makes the walls thick enough, the world can't get in. But I see Clara. I see the way she looks at our life like it's a ledger she hasn't finished auditing. She thinks I don't know about the investments she's making with Silas Vane. She thinks I don't see the way she's grooming Julian to be her hands inside our home. I felt a lump form in my throat. Sarah hadn't been a victim of the Vane's arrival. She had been a sentry. I've opened an account in a name Clara won't look for, the entry continued. The foundation. If the day ever comes when the walls start to lean, I've left the key in the one place Arthur always looks but never sees. I hope he never needs it. But if he does, I hope he remembers that a house isn't the ground you stand on, it's the people who stand with you. I looked at the key taped to the back of the notebook. It was for a small private vault in a coastal bank near Beaufort, the town where we'd spent our honeymoon. Sarah hadn't just left me memories. She'd left me a secondary foundation, built in secret, purely to protect us from the very people who shared our blood. Elena stirred beside me. She blinked, looking out at the marsh, then at me. Her lip was swollen, a dark purple reminder of Julian's true nature, but her eyes were clearer than I'd seen them in years. The lifestyle Julian had promised had been a fog. The violence had finally burned it away. "Where are we, Dad?" she asked, her voice small and rasping. "Almost home," I said. "Home isn't back there," she whispered, looking toward the west. "No, home is wherever we decide to start drawing the next set of plans." She looked at the notebook in my hand. "Is that Mom's?" I nodded, handing it to her. She knew Elena. She knew Clara was a snake before I even suspected it. She was trying to protect you long before I woke up. Elena read the pages in silence. I watched her face change the guilt, the grief, and then, finally, a flicker of the strength I'd feared she'd lost. She looked back at the kids, who were starting to wake up. "Grandpa?" Leo rubbed his eyes, squinting at the sunset. "Are we staying at another hotel?" I turned in my seat, ignoring the pinch of my broken ribs. I looked at the boy who shared my love for drafting and the girl who had my wife's fire. I remembered that moment in the courthouse, or rather, the moment in the driveway when Julian had rolled up the window and made me a stranger. "No, Leo," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I didn't try to hide. "We're going to a house by the ocean. It has a big porch, and there's a workshop in the back where we're going to build the best birdhouses in the state. And this time, nobody gets to tell us where we sleep." Chloe sat up, her messy hair catching the light. "Will there be a room for you, Grandpa?" "A real one. Not the garage?" The question was a tiny dagger, a reminder of the humiliation I'd endured. But I just smiled. "The biggest room in the house is mine, sweetheart, and it has windows that see the sunrise every single morning." "Good," she said, leaning forward to pat my shoulder. "Because you're the boss of the house." I caught Elena's eye in the rearview mirror. She was crying, but she was smiling through it. I realized then that my revenge wasn't the fall of Julian, or the exile of Silas, or the cold justice that had finally found Clara. Those were just the demolition phases. My true revenge was this moment of reclamation. I had my family back. Not the family I thought I had, but the one that had been forged in the fire of betrayal and found to be solid. We arrived in Beaufort, as the moon was rising over the Atlantic. The house by the ocean was a small, salt-weathered cottage that Sarah had bought through her secret account years ago. It was modest, but the bones were good. It stood on pilings above the sand, a structure designed to weather the tides. I stood on the deck that night, listening to the waves crash against the shore. The air was clean, stripped of the Charlotte smog and the heavy scent of Julian's arrogance. Elena was inside, tucking the kids into beds that smelled of sea air and fresh linens. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Elias Thorne. Final update. The Blackwoods found the offshore bridge. Clara is negotiating her exit, which means she'll be penniless and in hiding for the rest of her life. Julian and Silas are in federal custody. Turns out the forged signatures were the least of their problems. Once the FBI looked at the sports betting logs. You're clear, Arthur. The architect is officially off the hook. I deleted the message. I didn't need the updates anymore. I didn't need to know where the rubble had landed. I looked down at my hands. They were the hands of a man who had built a city, but tonight, they were just the hands of a grandfather. I thought about the moral of the story, the one I'd tell the kids when they were older. I'd tell them that you can't build anything lasting on a foundation of lies. I'd tell them that sometimes, you have to let a building fall so you can see the sky again. But mostly, I'd tell them about their grandmother, the woman who knew that the most important part of any structure isn't the steel or the stone, but the secret strength you keep in reserve for the people you love. I didn't know it yet, but the man who had returned from his sister's funeral 3 months ago, the tired, grieving man who had been pushed into a garage, was gone. In his place was someone new. Someone who knew that power isn't about owning the biggest house on Sterling Lane. Power is the ability to walk away from the wreckage and know exactly how to build something better. I turned and walked back into the house. The light was on in the kitchen, and I could hear Elena humming a song Sarah used to sing. It wasn't a palace, and it didn't have a master suite with a marble bath. But as I closed the door and turned the lock, I knew one thing for certain. The foundation was perfect. I walked to my room, the one with the windows facing the sea, and lay down. For the first time in 64 years, I didn't think about the load-bearing walls. I didn't think about the stress points or the blueprints. I just closed my eyes and listened to the tide coming in, washing away the last of the footprints on the sand. The time for revenge was over. The time for living had finally begun.